It now gives me great pleasure and privilege to introduce our opening speaker, Mr. Laurence Tosi. So it's always nice to start the day with somebody that doesn't just see the future, but has actually helped create it. So Laurence Tosi, or LT as we like to call him, has spent the last 3 decades building the future. He's no ordinary operator, investor, serial entrepreneur. He's like, this is the real deal. So when you imagine a resume where Airbnb, Blackstone, and Merrill Lynch aren't kind of just stops along the way, but platforms that he's helped shape from the inside out. He's been their CFO or COO, he's ran their businesses, headed their committees, drove their innovation and funded their growth. And if that's not enough, if you've ever bought a bond online or streamlined your private markets technology or used consolidated reporting, there's a pretty good chance you've used one of the platforms that LT has either created or supported with names like iPrio, TMC Bonds, themarkets.com, Adapar, iCapital, StubHub, and others. And of course, then there's Westcap, which is the powerhouse firm that he founded and leads, managing over $6 billion and driving the success of 38 portfolio companies. Oh, and I forgot to mention, he's also a Georgetown grad, BA, MBA, JD, and when he's not supporting scholarships of the next generation of Georgetown grad and sitting on their board of directors, he's spotting the next big thing before it's on many of our radars. So for our first keynote of the day, please give a warm Toronto welcome to LT, Mr. Laurence Tosi.
Thank you very much. It's great. Thank you.
Okay. LT, thank you again.
Of course.
Delighted to have you. So, okay, how did all these skills, you're an operator, investor, entrepreneur, corporate executive, how do they all come together, and how did, why did you embark on this multifaceted journey?
I'll start with the light question.
Yeah.
Curiosity. I think fundamentally, when you're a curious person, you're never content to be a settler. You're always thinking about being a pioneer. And for me, it's never being comfortable with what is, but always thinking about what could be. And what could be makes you uncomfortable because you don't know how you're going to get there. And so that's probably been the guiding force for making change in my life and seeing things. I'm also very frustrated by repetitive tasks. So software has always been interesting to me, so I'm thinking, I don't want to have to do that again, the same way. And so it's much about curiosity and thinking about and seeing patterns and wondering what could be next and what could you change that could have a scale impact for the better. And that's really what's driven my, as you said, kind of interesting career.
Yeah, and you've obviously had a boatload of successes, but I'm throwing curveballs right out of the gate. When you look at the most instructive mistakes that you've made in your career, what did those look like, and how have they shaped you?
Well, first of all, I think you look at the successes because you put them on your resume. I think all resumes should have a flip side. And we should put on the back all the things we made a complete mess out of. Because if you're not making a mess, and if you're not making mistakes, you're not trying hard enough. I've always thought when we ship a product, a software product, if we ship it and it's perfect, we probably waited too late. And so you need to have a little bit of that bold edge to satisfy what you're trying to make your change and to have a little bit of courage about what could go wrong. And that's how I think about the mistakes. I would say, and this is apropos for what I'm doing now, the biggest mistake I've made is I think the private capital world has become an asset gathering business by and large. And being the founder of a business like iPrio, which is the leading capital market software, I started it on my laptop. And I built the business and I ended up 12 years later, 13 years later, we have 2 giant growth equity firms invest in the business. My friends are running the business because I hired them all. And I was like, wow, these are financial engineers. They don't get what we're trying to do. And ultimately, they forced us to sell the business. Now, we sold it for $1.8 billion, and that was a great outcome, and everybody was really happy. But it made me realize, the creative process of building a world-class company can't sit in the hands of somebody who works for somebody else, who represents somebody else's capital that's not their own, because they could sit there in board meetings and ask me questions about gross margin. So whether it's 85 or 87 doesn't matter, or the net margin of was 35 or 36. What matters is what's the next product? How happy are your customers? And that was probably the biggest mistake, and I didn't just do it once, probably done it 3 or 4 times with businesses that I started. They ended up in the hands of people that weren't creative enough, I think, to continue reaching their potential. And for the $2 billion we made in IPO, we left 10 on the table. That I'm sure about.
Yeah, maybe this is a pretty good segue into Westcap. What was the idea behind starting it? Why?
I find that one of the best ways to make decisions is you tie together certain moments and you reflect on them. Sometimes in our busy lives, and I was listening to you before talk about phones, I have teenagers, so I know the distraction. We don't take enough time to just think about what just happened and what does it mean. And there were 2 watershed moments in my life. One was the one I just described, where you start a business, you build it with your friends, you become a market leader, and you sell a controlling interest to growth equity firms, and all of a sudden I realized like they're just solving for a very modest outcome relative to the dreams that we had when we built the business. The second time it came to me was when I went to, just a quick story if I may. The way I got to Airbnb was, I was at Blackstone at the time, and I didn't return a phone call from Brian Chesky, the founder. Apparently to millennials, that's a cardinal sin. Now, the fact that I was in China flying back didn't really matter to him. He showed up in the reception area at Blackstone unannounced and called my assistant and said, he didn't return my phone call. Can I buy him lunch? I came from San Francisco to see him. What? And I was like, I gotta see this guy for sure. So he walks upstairs, and he's walking down the hall of Blackstone, and he's dressed like right out of central casting for Silicon Valley. All black, he's got the satchel over his thing, you know those big sneakers with big, thick white soles. He's kind of waddling along. And he comes into my office and he goes, do you think anybody will recognize me? I said, Brian, they think you're here to fix my iPhone. and that little guy you just walked by, that's Steve Schwarzman. He goes, yes, that same guy. And together, before I ever went, while I was still at Blackstone, I started helping Brian and the other 2 founders write the business plan of what would become Airbnb. And I remember Sunday morning in San Francisco, I went in because I was still CFO of Blackstone and I didn't want people seeing me in the building and that type of stuff. And I was just an investor at this point. Westcap was an investor, a very early investor in Airbnb. And I made a presentation to the board. And the board were some of the best venture capitalists in the world, incredibly smart people. They've done more deals and seen more than I ever will. But what struck me is, after working on this for 3 months with 3 founders, Mo, was that that's not something that the venture capitalists helped them do. Yeah. But yet, I'd grown up in a world where we started, when I got to Blackstone, it was small, it was $3 billion, and I left when it was 450. It was a big, different business, right? It was $3 billion in market cap when I got there. It's 210 now. And that's those 2 events, the passivity of the financial investors I sold IPO to, and the venture capitalists being interested in finding new deals but not necessarily helping you scale, gave me the idea of what if I took the innovation that's such a special part of venture capital and matched it with operational excellence, which is the hallmark of a great private equity firm like Blackstone, and put them together. So it was those 2 moments that I said almost the day I got to Airbnb. I said, one, I have to learn how to run a business like this, and when I'm done, I'm gonna go build the firm I wish I had that was with me, and the investors that were with me in those 2 experiences, so we could get to where we wanted to go. And that was the idea.
So this idea that I think you've referred to as operating equity model, which kind of bridges venture capital and private equity. When you look at, and it obviously differs from the traditional approach, but like when you look at what's going on in the markets today, why do you believe that that's a more compelling strategy today as opposed to some of the previous vintages?
Well, I think it's really important for everybody in the room. You're going to see over the next decade a torrent of private capital ideas. You're going to get more phone calls, sold more products for more people in more things that you never thought of. And most of you started with building your own businesses. Keep that in mind, but there's a lot coming at you. I believe the thing that matters most in asset management is that you have a sustained competitive advantage in what you do. I used to have this somewhat rude word I would put into my Blackstone strategy decks. It was called an unfair advantage. We sought for places where we could compete where others couldn't over a sustainable period. So the idea behind Westcap was, how do I fill the gap between venture capital, which is great at finding ideas and funding business plans and trying to find product market fit. How do I come after that and leverage the best of venture capital during a period where the companies are high growth, our businesses grow about 35% year over year, help them scale and prepare themselves to potentially be bought by private equity in the public markets. And that is a sustainable idea because, believe it or not, growth equity firms don't do that. They're either buyout firms taking non-control positions. So how are they going to help the companies? They don't control it, so they're not going to help it. And even if they wanted to, the skill set that we used to optimize Blackstone private equity companies, lean management, supply chain management, that's not applicable to a high-growth software company. And so if we could find the space in the middle where we could create long-term sustainable value, effectively operate like private equity and be creative like venture capital, then we would have a sustainable difference. And that's what I was searching for.
And one of the things that you did say when you were at Blackstone, I mean, you've kind of leveraged this idea of scale begets skill, right? So on some level, yes, you're bringing these two worlds together, but there are still competitive advantages of scale that smaller firms struggle to match. How do you overcome that deficit, or how have you maybe reimagined that approach with Westcap?
So you'll hear later from my former partner, Ken Kaplan, who's not only a great investor, but an amazing human being. And they scaled, when I got to Blackstone, our real estate funds were about $2 billion. Now the main fund's about 30, and real estate manages about $350 billion in assets. We figured out early on that if we had the scale, we'd be able to finance the deals better, we'd be able to see more, and we'd make seismic shifts like, this is going to be a good decade for urban office. This is going to be a good decade for hotels, and right now, this is a good decade for e-commerce infrastructure and for AI data warehouses. So for Blackstone, the strategy, our sustainable advantage was scale. For Westcap, it's skill. And what does that mean? So I needed to go out and I needed to build a team which consists of people who have built and scaled some of the most successful businesses in technology history. Apple, Google, of course, Airbnb, iPrio. And so the team is full of people who are in the prime of their careers who have gone through building the businesses. Because when we sit across from an operator, a founder, they want to know that you can help them and that you actually can show them what to do and work with them, not just tell them. They're not interested in just financial investors at that point.
Yeah, and so just I want to talk double click on the talent side of the equation. I mean, just given the uniqueness of your own journey and your own experiences, did that, if at all, translate into how you structure Westcap, either organizationally, strategically, from a human capital point of view? Anything on that point?
So I totally cheated. I just went back to my career and I found the best people I work with who were great humans, who were good at what they did, and I recruited all of them. So I'm not kidding. So when you look at they were either at iPrio, Blackstone, or Airbnb, fundamentally the partners, or some of them were like at three of the four.
Nobody at Merrill?
I know we've got two people from Merrill.
Okay.
Mike Sotiros, my partner here, he's been with me for 30 plus years, I think, from Merrill to Blackstone to here. So, but I also knew what each one of them would do different. And let me explain kind of what they do. So we have the two heads of growth marketing at Airbnb. That's how we built the business. We were spending $1 billion a year. They're both data scientists, Diane Chor and Maria Wong. They were great at that. Alan Mask, who's one of my partners, was the head of product at Airbnb. So I went and found people that were really good at what they did, and then they built teams around that. And that's how we kind of put it together.
Yeah. I heard, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I think I remember you telling me that you've made some investments in Canada. Now, for those of us who are insecure on this side of the border, thinking the grass is always greener on the other side, maybe just talk to us like how that came into play into your strategy.
Well, I'm on a couple of Canadian boards, and they keep referring to me as almost Canadian. I guess growing up in northern New Hampshire makes you almost Canadian. I'm super flattered by that comment, by the way. So it came about, the Canadian venture capital community and growth equity community is very cohesive.
Yeah.
It's a smaller community. People treat each other well. Reputation and relationships matter. And you'll find quite often a combination of your best investment firms in Canada and the pension funds on a board. It's very typical. They all know each other. And so when we first started investing in Canadian companies, it actually came from references, and I'll give you a couple names. One of our first investors was in a business called Hopper. Has anybody heard what Hopper is? This is, if you haven't, you should look at it. I'll bet if you have kids that are using it, Hopper is a new age travel app. Think of it as the Airbnb, except you can book flights, hotels, and cars. Amazing business, started in Montreal, took about 8 years to get to when it had revenue. We invested in that first. Not surprisingly, their board has CDPQ and OMERS and some of the local firms. And our job's to go in, we invested in the company, it was doing about $25 million of revenue. The pandemic came. We didn't run, we leaned in. We made the company better, and now it's at $750 million a year, and it's the third largest online travel agency in the world. That took a lot of work, but if we do that work and we can prove to the Canadian investors on that board that we can do a good job and we can be trusted, then, and for that outcome, and we got through the pandemic, we wrote checks when probably nobody else would. We bought shares from people who were afraid it wasn't gonna work. That then led to the next deal we had, which is we invested in a great company. You haven't heard of it yet. You will in the next couple of years. It's called AppDirect. It was started by Nicolas Desmarais, who's from here, who's from Montreal, excuse me. Great business. We got there because the board members of Hopper said, you really should meet this young entrepreneur. They're gonna build the next great, I think, Canadian technology company. It's an amazing business. You'll hear about it in the next few years. We invested, it was probably doing 70 million in revenue. Now it's at 300 plus. And so what I really love about the Canadian investment community is its relationships. One other point, Canadian venture capitalists are way more conservative than they are in the Valley. They focus on relationships. They focus on building the companies the right way. Their calculators don't have minus 100 million. They just don't, and they won't do it well. And that's actually good because when we invest, it's after the venture capitalists. These businesses are run well, they're not bleeding lots of money. The problem with Silicon Valley is and always will be one word, momentum. They compete largely on speed and price. Now, I looked at the backgrounds of a lot of people in the room. You've built some incredible businesses. None of you compete on speed and price. You just don't. It's just not a sustainable business model. So it's been a really great experience. I'm sure there'll be more companies for us over time, but investing in the Canadian ecosystem is great. And those are businesses, by the way, they're all global businesses now. They started here, and now they're global.
Maybe I ask you to just go one level deeper. Like when you find a company you really like, how do you develop real conviction around that business?
Well, we have a certain level of criteria. You know, we've looked at, over 25 years, we've probably looked at, I can't even do the numbers now, but we've probably done 100 plus investments. We always look first for somebody who's solving a problem that's really personal. It sounds odd, doesn't it? Somebody's solving a personal problem. What does that mean? The three founders of Airbnb couldn't make rent. Two of them were designers and one of them was an engineer from Harvard. And they couldn't make rent. So during a particular weekend, I'm sure all of you have stayed in San Francisco, and I'm sure you're totally underwhelmed by what you get for your hotel spend. And that I could say with all certainty. They couldn't find enough places for the designers to stay in San Francisco for a design conference. So the three musketeers figured out, well, let's just rent out our airbed and we'll feed them Pop-Tarts. That's how it started. That was a personal journey. When I met the three founders, they never said once about how much money they could make or what that would look like. They cared about building a great product that let people participate in the digital economy by using their homes or apartments, and that guests around the world would meet each other and strangers would become friends. That's how they thought about it. That's a personal journey. A founder like that is never gonna give up. Now, same token, we've said no to deals that everybody in the room would be familiar with, because they meet the founder and it's all about money and valuation stuff. I'm like, I always tell them, it's not what you start in this business, it's what you finish. And you could end up like the ones who got fired colossally on the front page of the papers, or you could end up like Brian Chesky at Airbnb or Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, Meta. Because those two both believe with their hearts what they could build, not just with their heads or their wallets. And that's what we look for, somebody who can really build something great. We also look for big markets with software-like margins where the market leader can have sustainable competitive advantage over a very long period of time.
And so if I just turn to the other side of that coin, what's your process or approach or philosophy for thinking about risk and risk management?
So risk management, first of all, every day you wake up, you have to realize you're in the risk business, period. right? And more importantly, it's a very heavy burden to manage money for other people. If you look at the background of our firm, we actually started largely with family offices. Why? Because they pattern recognize what we were doing. They look at it and go, oh, I see, you've built businesses like this before, therefore you can add value and identify the winner of the future. It's a relatively simple strategy. On the risk management side, you can never break that down. Like risk management is taking every single knowable variable and understanding that variable, and so that the leap of faith of what you don't know is as small as possible. What does that take? Enormous amounts of hard work. It takes ingenuity around how do you really figure out what this person's all about? What are they really trying to accomplish? And then we have risk systems. So when I was at Blackstone, I started a company called iLevel, which is, if any of you are private equity investors, those are those reports you get that show the portfolio company returns. Because I just didn't want to sit in a room with an investment analyst massaging numbers. I was like, just show me the facts. Let's start with the facts. And then we can talk about like how we interpret them. And so risk management should always be at the core of what you do. It's a word that's often lost in Silicon Valley in the investment because they're thinking about this next thing there. And if you look at, that's how you get to these incongruous results of valuations of hundreds of times revenues for companies with negative margins. And so we've always focused on Blackstone-like risk management. You'll see Ken in a little bit. He's the CIO of Blackstone. We spent years figuring out how to diligence companies, how to assemble the diligence into a thesis, and then track our assumptions. Every deal we do, there's going to be something we missed, and even if the deal goes as well as some of the deals I've mentioned, there's still something you could do better. So you wake up every day and you get in the team's brain, get better, get smarter, learn from everything we do.
And when you level up from the specific risks of an individual company or investment, what are the biggest risks that you're paying attention to today?
You know, Mo, you really got to make sure you have the right partners and stakeholders. What does that mean? You have to have the right founders and managers. Because in the moment of truth, when they're under stress, you're going to find out who you're dealing with. All of us know this from our personal histories in life. You just know it. That's a personal judgment, and you have to do it. All of us spend enormous amount of time with these management teams. In fact, my wife and I take the founders out to dinner. Mrs. Tosi is a much harder grader than I am, and she's a very successful businesswoman in her own right. She's seen things I haven't, and she's been right. So one is understand the people and deeply understand them. Spend the time. It's not about a pitch book. And if you have to compete on price and speed, and they're like, oh, you got a week to forget it. You don't value what we can do. And so that's probably one of the biggest risks. The other one is don't invest in things that people like. Invest in things that people love, even if it's small. Like, this product's kind of like another one. That doesn't really matter. Find something that's really different that you really love, that really works, and then invest in it. I had been using Airbnb for years before I ever met the team or invested in the company, partially because I have 4 kids, and they're really good at depreciating hotel assets. They're really good at it. They can break anything. And I was like, maybe we should do this in a house. And so I just loved the product. And I was really psyched when I met the team, and I was like, yeah, but they were thinking narrow. I was like, this thing could be the biggest hospitality company in the history of the world, and we don't have to buy a single asset. And that's where we're at.
And so, I mean, using Airbnb as an example, but you've been pretty good about looking around corners. When you look out over the next 5 years in technology development, what do you see?
This is a really exciting time. We have a chart that goes all the way back, this will sound really corny, goes all the way back to like the adoption of electricity and the debate they had over AC and DC current. And if you look at that, to telephones, to the internet, there are adoption curves. And the adoption curves have accelerated with time, silicon chips. You go through each adoption curve and we match how long it took to get to a certain level of penetration. And if you look at these curves over the last almost 100 years, you will see they get faster and faster and faster. Well, the latest one is AI. And it's not that AI is new. I mean, IBM Watson was beating the greatest chess player in the world 30 years ago. What's new about it is its ubiquity, the billions that are being spent on it, and the devices we all have to access it. To access Gary Kasparov paying IBM Watson, you had to be in there next to their giant mainframe in a room. And this is your phone now. My children quiz ChatGPT all day. I think that's the next quantum shift forward. Now there's positive and negatives that come with it, but I think that's a quantum shift. I also think the ubiquity and price of personal devices has reached a level now where if you had told me that in 8 years we'd build the largest hospitality company in the history of mankind without buying a single piece of property, I would say, no way we could do that. That's Airbnb. No way it gets there without phones. No way. So the infrastructure to get software out in the hands of people through the cloud and through devices is more than I've ever seen. So I think so one last comment on this. Very important to look at. Why do we invest in technology? For the last 20 years, the technology GDP globally has grown faster than GDP by 4x. Compound that over time, that's pretty amazing. I think it'll even be faster over the next 10 years. It's literally gaining momentum, and we see it in the speed of the companies scaling, and obviously the valuations and you'll see in the public markets reflect the fact that the technology gap, if you will, between traditional industries and technology is growing, not shrinking.
And I think, those are great points. I think most of us would probably agree with all of those views. Is there any contrarian or highly unconventional views that are driving your strategies and decisions?
Well, there always should be, and if there's not, somebody else should be running the firm. We try to create a very irreverent culture. I haven't worn closed-toe shoes in like 6 months. We are very irreverent. You might even say we're kind of California, touchy-feely. We're San Francisco, New York, and London. But we run a very irreverent culture. And we have kind of no rules.
Yeah.
And so like anybody can come up with an idea. Like we don't even publish our org charts because that's just not how you get creative. So you should always be thinking contrarian. And when anything feels like it's too good to be true, it's too good to be true. So we're in a bubble now too, a dangerous bubble. So I did the following exercise. I sent out a note about 8 years ago. I sent out a note to our investors saying why the we doesn't work, talking about WeWork. And I just simply show them, and some of you are in the real estate business, I was like, what are your revenues? Well, our revenues are $1.5 billion. Oh, really? Do you pay rent? Yeah. Do you service the buildings? Uh-huh. Do you pay for communications? Right. And that's like flavored water over there too. You provide that right. Net that all from your revenues. Their revenues were $30 million net with $1.5 billion fixed cost base the day they filed their S1. And that business is never going to make it. We're seeing that right now, I believe. So just being kind of irreverent, I sat down on a long flight the other day and tapped out a 2-page letter to my teammates and our investors saying, the we in GPT. So I asked ChatGPT, what's gross margin? Okay, gross margin is minus your variable costs. Okay, what's a variable cost? And I took the pitch deck for ChatGPT and I said, variable cost, variable cost, variable cost, variable cost. What's the gross margin of ChatGPT? Anybody want to guess? Minus 60%. Minus 60%. Dollar revenue cost them $1.60. Ouch. And I just used their own ChatGPT and asked all the questions. Although I think they flavored a little bit. The last question I asked, it said, well, if in the case of a AI company, what's considered gross margin could be flexible. I'm like, love that. I love that. I love that they're in there back there changing the answers while they're raising money. So the answer is, there will be great things to come. You don't need to be the first in, and you don't need to pay the highest price. Because typically, the first out of the gate that gains the highest valuation and the most attention is the one that's first to get disrupted. Everybody remembers AOL, Yahoo, I could keep, HomeAway, VRBO, beat Airbnb. We just built a better product and wiped them out. So be careful of what comes first, and be careful of the bubbles. And just go back to the fundamental principles you always had is, how does it make money? And that's the irreverent part of not accepting anything at face value. Like when people come in and do us pitches, there'll be like 8 of us in the room who'll be like, I don't get it. And sometimes we're like, wow, this is amazing. So.
Putting aside the bubble that we're seeing in tech, is there anything else in global markets or investing that concerns you right now? Anything in the sort of and maybe even going one level deeper, given some of the geopolitical uncertainty, how are you advising your portfolio companies around what you're seeing in the broader world?
So let me start with the more difficult of the two. The geopolitical situation is highly unstable. And I'm not really sure why the markets aren't taking it more seriously. I mean, I was in Helsinki maybe a month ago, and I was amazed. Now Finland, for those of you who've been, is an amazingly placid pace, and they pride themselves on how like steady is as steady goes. Incredible economy, incredible people. They are. The first question I got in a room full of investors was, "Do you think there'll be civil war after your election?" I'm like, "Wow." I'm like, "Civil war as the Finns describe it, or civil war as we describe it? Our civil wars are ugly." And so that's just American centric. I really obviously worry about what's happening in the Middle East. I do worry about the aggression in Russia and China, just to be perfectly blunt. And so you need to be very, very careful right now. And now I'll get to what we're telling the portfolio companies. This is important. One thing I learned from Blackstone, and you're about to see Ken Kaplan in a few minutes, was centralize risk management and data collection, decentralize it, how you affect it and operate it. Does that make sense? So our data and research says this morning the US printed a GDP number of 2.9, exceptionally healthy, right? Very healthy number, for sure. A little bit of that's driven by some inflationary factors, but good. When you have those geopolitical concerns, you have a consumer that is showing some resilience, but we're late in the cycle. We go out and we bring all the CEOs together and we show them our macro research and we tell them, you don't have to be brave, just be careful. Because right now I feel like we're more towards the end of a good market than we are at the beginning. And so nobody's ever gonna harm you for growing 30% versus 40. Be cautious. Maybe you should always be cautious, but be particularly cautious given macroeconomic right now. And so what we're telling them is long-term projects with a long-term return, shelve them. Make efficiency a core value. Look at adjacent markets that you can get into. Search for weakened competitors. Keep your balance sheet with you. And that's basically what we've been telling them for the last 6 months. So we're preaching caution, and we've probably decelerated. So this year, our portfolio companies will grow about 37% gross margin. We actually track that because it matters. And about 32% in revenues, which means they're doing the right thing. They're getting more optimized.
Yeah.
That's how we're managing the market now.
So maybe bringing that down to the folks in this room. I mean, one of the facts that most people may not be aware of, doesn't show up in your bio, is that you also manage the family office for Steve Schwartzman and the other Blackstone partners. And then obviously you've been around large asset managers, you now have your own firms. So when you, as you're advising, what advice might you give to families and family offices? They're thinking about their own allocations and the opportunities in front of them.
Well, I can't say which family offices I manage, but I'll having never, by the way, I did not know that was part of the job of going to Blackstone. I had no idea. I knew when I got a call to write a check for buying a new car, I was like, oh, this is what a family office is like. So I took a very different approach to it. And at that time, the partners had, kind of put together, and most of their investments were in the firm's funds. Here's the first thing I did. And the first thing I think you should all do with your family offices. Write an income statement, a cash flow statement, and a balance sheet. Start there in real time. Now, being a career finance and CFO, that's like what I knew about family offices. But I literally spent probably 6 months automating all of our systems so that I could aggregate all of the holdings across everything. And I mean everything, down to real estate, down to housing costs, down to mortgage payment, everything I could find. And I assembled, and there were only 3 people working for me just on the offices, family offices, and just assembled a P&L, an income statement, cash flow, and balance sheet. And from there, I actually assembled it into a little app, and then gave a iPad, pushed the button, he goes, oh, it's magic. It took a lot of work. But if you start there, then you'll also know how to invest and how to invest in alternatives. Because you need to look at the risks and the cash flows and the recognition and the character of the income you have now to understand what's right for you. And the problem with the private asset industry, these asset gatherers, they'll sell you anything. But you always ask the question, where does it fit? Do I need more ordinary income? What is my 10 or 15% of my assets that are my long-term compounding stuff where I can take more risk, good or not? What's the drawdown cycle for a long-term private equity fund or credit fund? Like understanding all that. So I just took it and I went forward 5 years and actually discovered, not through the family office, something really interesting, which was kind of frightening. So this is 2008. I looked at the commitments that Blackstone made. This is an amazing story. Obviously, in a quiet room, I can say it. I went through, and first I did it for the partners. I was like, oh my. All the commitments we made to Blackstone, our own funds, at the time we went public in 2007, if we go through an extended period, which happened, of no realizations and only drawdowns, we're gonna run out of money. This is Blackstone itself. And I was like, and I showed that to my partners, like, you must be wrong. I'm like, I'm not wrong about that. And I had to go out, and I had to then walk into S&P, Moody's, and Fitch, and explain to them what an alternative asset manager was, and actually had to explain to them our business model. And I came up with this term called net fee-related earnings. Totally made it up. But that just showed them that we made money off our management fees and we could pay our bonds. Then I came up with economic net income. Can't send your college kids through college on that one. By the way, the industry still uses these things. I made them up. It was just a way to describe something. So I think it's really important to understand what you have, the risk you're taking from an income, cash flow, and balance sheet perspective, and then understand what your horizons are, whether you're doing this amazing charity here today, what's that horizon, and plan that far ahead. Because if you mismatch that, it will exaggerate the downturns when things aren't going through the right cycles. And so that would be my advice. Run it like you're a CFO.
Amazing. That's a great story. Before we wrap up this amazing conversation, I'd love to throw a couple rapid fire questions your way. It's like, think of it like a little bit of a lightning round. Don't overthink the responses. First thing that comes to mind, this is my own shtick. Ideally 30 seconds or less in responding. Is that okay?
How about one word?
Well, you do your best.
Try.
Well, let me start one that's more than one word. Most interesting experience with Steve Schwartzman or Brian Chesky?
So I got a call one night from Steve, and his corporate credit card got declined. Do not have a billionaire decline his corporate credit card. He calls me and I said, where are you? Oh, I'm in Colombia. Where? Bogota. No, specifically where, Steve? In the Gun and Hunt Club. And I'm like, of course Citigroup is going to deny a charge from you, Steve, in Bogota's Hunt and Gun Club. They don't think it's you. Anyway, he never got over that. He never got over it. With Brian, the funniest thing I ever saw was we got Warren Buffett asked to meet us in the early days of Airbnb because he realized we were putting up posters around Omaha, Nebraska, advertising Airbnb because there aren't enough hotel rooms for people to go to his annual meeting because he fills the stadium. And so he asked to go see us. So we go see him. The boys put on ties. I didn't know they owned them. We got there. We go through the pitch, and Charlie Munger and Buffett don't say a thing. Nothing. And they're super nervous. We finish, they go, that is the dumbest idea I've ever heard. Hold on, wait for it. I wish I thought of it. Will you guys sell it? We walked out of the room, I'm like, we're never selling. We're done. They're like, what does this all mean? I'm like, I'll explain it to you like in a decade, but we're not selling. So those are probably two of the funnier stories.
That's great. Favorite quote or expression?
Fear should be your only fearlessness.
Okay. Let me take a back to Airbnb. Any quick insider tips for renting on Airbnb?
Did my wife ask you to ask that question? Yeah, here's the super easy one. Read the reviews. Pictures lie. Let me tell you, with these cameras today, you can make anything look good. Mike and I were in Copenhagen a few weeks ago, and wow, did we get smacked. And he's like, I thought you were the Airbnb expert. I'm like, wow, that was really difficult. That was a long night with a lot of trash cans banging away in the alley.
Speaking of your wife, what do your family members make the most fun of you about?
Apparently, I'm an endless source of entertainment. My son can imitate me better than anybody. I guess he is most known for the deep voice and talking too fast. So they make fun of me about everything, and I'm glad they do.
Growing up, who is your greatest inspiration?
Steve Jobs. I grew up, I was a scholarship student, I put myself through school, and they had a contest in New Hampshire to win an Apple computer if you could sell the most magazines. And so I got one of those old, at a thrift shop, I got one of those old lawyers. Remember the little cases that lawyers used to hold? They have sections in them, right? When they had the big red welts. Everybody know what I'm talking about? And I put in the different sections, different types of magazines. And I would, by the way, knocking on doors in New Hampshire is a little dangerous, especially today, but everybody's armed to the hilt. I'd knock on the door, and depending on who came to me, I'd figure out which one of the slots I'd go in. I'd either show them like American Home or like Hunt and Stream or Gun Club. And I sold the most, and I got it. And I got my first Apple computer, and I wrote a thank you note to Steve Jobs. And fortunately, years later, I not only got a chance to meet him, but I got a chance to tell him that story. And then I also said to him, but you didn't include the monitor. That took me another 6 months of work to buy the monitor. He goes, no, don't worry, this is true. No, don't worry, the next one, it's all gonna be in one. And I'm like, okay. A little late on that one, Steve, but thank you.
Oh my God, LT, this is amazing.
Thank you.
I just thank you so much for taking us on this like tour de force of your incredible journey and career. I mean, anybody that leaves $10 billion on the table is worth listening to. And you know, you took all this time to join us in Toronto. We appreciate it. So as a small token of our appreciation, we had an LT drawing, actually.
Oh, no.
Yeah, commissioned. And a special donation has been made in your honor in pediatric mental health.
Oh.
So,
Thank you so much.
thank you.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Here, take a, oh, there, which one? Take a,
You got
thank you again.
Georgetown, too.
Yeah, exactly.